some administrative updates, and then we will turn to the speakers for today's webinar. So you all should probably have seen that 1.6 was released on Monday, was deployed yesterday. If you are having any problems with your OCAT user account, such as that you're locked out or you can't reset your password, please contact one of your designated OCAT county administrators. If you call the help desk for these types of issues, we actually will have to refer you back to your county administrator. The major changes that were in 1.6 was an additional password security, a warning message when you're entering a new case for an existing client based on matching client identification numbers, and actually extremely relevant to today's webinar, we have revised the questions related to human trafficking. And so some of the revisions that we made. So prior to 1.6 in the domestic abuse safety section, H4, the question was, can you leave your job or situation if you want? And have you been threatened if you try to leave? Now with 1.6, it's, are you being forced by another person or persons to stay in your job or situation? Or have you, and the second question is, have you or your family been threatened if you try to leave? So that is the questions that have been changed as it relates to human trafficking questions in 1.6. Some other updates. As of last week, we have over 82,000 clients that have been appraised using OCAD, and of that, about 12.8% have identified themselves as a potential human trafficking sexual exploitation victim. So very relevant for today's webinar. So with that, I will actually introduce our speakers. It is Sharan Dhanoa, who's the coordinator of South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, who facilitates collaboration among the over 35 member agencies of the coalition, and Perla Flores, who's the program director with Community Solutions, the director of the Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault, and Human Trafficking programs at Community Solutions, which is a nonprofit human services agency serving South Santa Clara County and San Benito County. She also chairs the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. Our speakers will provide an overview of human trafficking and key considerations for identifying victims during an OCAT interview. And so with that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Great, thank you so much. So we already had a brief introduction. I'm Sharan Dhanoa. I'm the coordinator with the South Bay Coalition and Human Trafficking. We're a collaborative in the South San Francisco Bay Area. Been around since 2003, really, working collaboratively with law enforcement agencies, attorneys, direct service providers, and outreach groups to really comprehensively approach the issue. Perla Flores, who's also here, has also been working on this issue for over a decade. One of the unique things about the South Bay Coalition is it's had a really equal focus on labor trafficking and sex trafficking over the years, and really looks at the intersection. So we'll really be talking about intersections and where you can see human trafficking throughout your OCAT system. So I wanted to start with a quick poll of where everybody's coming from in terms of your role within CalWorks. Everybody probably got it in there by now, hopefully. Let's see. Okay, great. Well, I got a bunch of zeros here, but that's okay. We can continue forward. Hopefully we have a diversity of case managers as well as administrators on the line.
It looks like we have 67% case managers, 19% supervisors, and 2% administrators, and 12% other.
Great, thank you so much. I was just getting a bunch of zeros. I knew that wasn't right. So in terms of our learning objectives, really we're here to talk about what the definition of human trafficking is, how broad the scope is of this definition, and then identifying potential cases within your system and then referring clients to appropriate resources. Part of that is really understanding this whole network of resources and agencies that are combating trafficking and really knowing what's out there. So I also wanted to get a sense of what everybody's kind of knowledge is about human trafficking. If people have some basic knowledge, 0 to 3 years, intermediate, advanced, if we can do a quick poll on that, that would be great. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we have a vast majority of people have basic knowledge, 78%, and then a good number, 12%, have no knowledge, and about 10% have 3+ years. So hopefully we'll be able to provide a good overview as well as provide some more in-depth tips for people who have a good knowledge base as well. So in terms of the definition of human trafficking, you can kind of think of it as 3 major categories. It really is exploitation, but you can see the first and second categories involve commercial sexual exploitation. The key piece here is that when someone's under the age of 18, you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. It's really when someone is either recruited, transported, or they're involved with any kind of commercial sexual exploitation under the age of 18, they are a human trafficking victim. When they're over the age of 18, then we have this added element of force, fraud, or coercion. And you'll see that's also with regards to labor and or services, that the force, fraud, or coercion is necessary to show human trafficking. Another way of looking at this definition is through the AMP model, which kind of breaks it down in a more easily identifiable way. You have 3 components. You have the action. So you can see you have recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for the purpose of the commercial sex or for their labor or services. And the way that you do that is through force, fraud, or coercion. We're going to unwrap a lot of these pieces as we go along, but again, when we go back to the previous page, force, fraud, and coercion is not necessary if you're under the age of 18. You do not have to show that element. But for anybody over the age of 18, you do have to show force, fraud, or coercion. And one of the hardest pieces, I think, with this definition is that most of the time it's very difficult to see the force, fraud, or coercion. It is very much subtle, psychological. It very rarely is actual physical restraints, which I think people have a general, overall people have to have a sense that there is some kind of force. It can be withholding documents. It can be threats to family back home. So it can be more subtle than I think what the general public seems to think. So we also provided a few different handouts that can also help flesh out these definitions. So don't feel like you have to write it all down, but we included some common trafficking myths that we hear from the public. One is people have a sense that trafficking usually only includes people coming over the border, that they have to be foreign nationals. And you can already see with the definition that that's not the case. There's nothing in there about having to be a foreign national. I think people focus a lot on the transporting piece of the definition, and while that's included in the definition, it can also be somebody who's recruiting somebody. So these are individuals at each stage of the process, somebody who might actually set things up. It might be the boyfriend who kind of initiates somebody, begins the exploitation process. They're all considered traffickers. Again, trafficking is not smuggling. Smuggling is very much, it is an illegal activity, but it doesn't necessarily involve people doing things against their will. And trafficking, again, it doesn't have to be across the border. So I think that's usually a common myth that people tend to have as well. And then the last point I already mentioned is that physical restraint is not necessary. Control can be psychological. It can be threats. It can be withholding paperwork. It can be isolation. It can be a lot of the same tactics that are used within domestic violence abuse situations. And we'll go more into depth with that as well. In terms of venues, a lot of people don't realize that there are individuals who are being trafficked within our everyday life. So you can see with labor trafficking, hospitality service industry is actually very high risk with hotels and restaurants. And I should note that we have two categories here, sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but we actually see a lot of crossover. So with hotels, when we provide training to hotels, we're training both on having staff being able to recognize whether someone is a patron at the hotel who might be sexually exploiting a minor or an adult. And we're also trying to get them to see that many times with subcontractors, there's labor trafficking situations. You can see also with labor trafficking, construction industry is very high risk, domestic servitude is very high risk, agriculture. With sex trafficking, I think most people will generally think of these areas of domestic pimp control, so that might be the physical track. Many times it's online. Massage parlors, again, a note about massage parlors is that there tends to be a lot of crossover with labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So people are being exploited for their services, labor, as well as commercial sexual exploitation. In terms of how we address the issue of trafficking, we really try to follow the State Department. They focus on the 4 Ps, and it just provides a really good overview of how we try to address this issue: the prevention of trafficking, protection, prosecution, and then partnerships. And so it really covers, again, when I talked about our collaborative being law enforcement, direct service providers, attorneys, as well as outreach groups, that really helps us tackle each one of these areas and ensure that we take a comprehensive approach. Today, we're really hoping to focus on identification of potential survivors, as well as prevention, because a lot of the risk factors that you're seeing are risk factors for trafficking, and then connecting those individuals to resources. So getting more into the OCAT system that you have, that was a really brief overview. And I should also say that if you have questions along the way, I know I'm going fairly quickly just so we can get into the meat of the OCAT system. But if you do have questions along the way, go ahead and add them. We'll have questions at the end. I wanted to get a sense of how much, it sounds like with the note in the beginning of 8% people being identified as trafficking, that quite a few people are using the system. So it'd be great to see how many people are actually using the human trafficking component in the OCAT system. Okay, maybe we can see the results. I think people have had a second there. Oh, great. Okay, so in terms of poll results, we have 46% feel that the questions are clear and adequate. About almost 30% to 28% feel that you do use the questions, but they don't adequately identify trafficking. 13% are not familiar enough to identify trafficking, and 13% are other. It'd be great if the people who indicated other could put those in terms of questions that we can address at the end as well. But hopefully we can clarify as we go along ways that you can flush out more of those red flags. So what we did is we took a look at your OCAT, at the OCAT system. What we have up here is where you would see, well, you know better than I do, but this is your report of your clients and the different strengths and barriers areas that they have. So we highlight a few of your key areas that we feel you could ask questions that might be more in the context of specific subjects. So So in your employment questions, there might be ways that you can ask questions that might highlight a red flag of trafficking within housing, within the health questions, substance use, domestic violence, and then the relationship questions. So these are 6 key areas where we feel like you can probably get a bit more information that will help you see if there are red flags for trafficking. So we did input the updated questions that you have in the OCAT system, and first of all, I think the questions are good questions. They are definitely on point with being questions to flesh out if someone's being exploited and cannot leave that situation. One of the key things is I know that there was a change to the first question of, are you being forced by another person to stay in your job situation? And one of the key distinctions here is really, we really need to flesh out whether or not that's based on obligation. When we're talking about trafficking, we're really talking about whether someone cannot actually leave, and it's that, again, coming back to force, fraud, or coercion. Do they actually have the choice of leaving? And that doesn't relate to family obligation. So it's not necessarily a family obligation. Sometimes I think it gets confusing when people might be here with particular visas, and so they're tied to a workplace because of a visa. Again, that's not... that would not be a trafficking situation unless the employer is exploiting that individual and then using that immigration status as a threat to report that individual. So again, I noted that you might want to flesh out the nature of threats. So have you or your family been threatened if you try to leave? And just fleshing out the nature of those threats might actually help uncover whether there are some substantial red flags there. Focusing on the means of control. So when someone says they can't leave their job, why do they think they can't leave the job? Is it, again, does somebody have their paperwork? Are they holding status over their head? Maybe they're holding something else over them as a means of control. Make sure to explore whether there's exploitation. So it's not just a matter of if they're getting paid appropriately, there still has to be labor or sexual exploitation that's happening. So you still have to be able to show that they're not getting paid the wages that they are owed under our law. And let's see, I mean, in terms of the questions, I think someone keeping the doors locked. You just want to make sure that it's not just having doors on your locks, on your windows and doors, but who's controlling those locks? Who are they not actually able to leave? Perhaps their family is forced. So is someone picking them up and taking them places? We'll get more into the specific areas with transportation as well, but just to give an overview of these questions, I think they're good questions, but what you may find is that they are more easy to flush out in the context of your other questions. So is anyone forcing you to do anything you don't want to do is a very general question. It's very vague. But again, that's something that you might flush out more when we're talking about domestic violence or if there are indications of sexual assault as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Perla. She's going to be going through the very specific questions, problem areas as well.
Thank you, Sharon. And so I want to start off first talking a little bit about vulnerabilities and barriers to seeking support. And I think that the first barrier, I think significant barrier for domestic violence service providers and sexual assault service providers that have extended our services to human trafficking victims is that a lot of human trafficking victims, or the majority, actually the large majority, do not identify as human trafficking victims. And in fact, in the over 10 years that we've been doing this work, and at this point have supported close to 400 individuals, we've had probably at the most 5 that have come to us seeking support as a human trafficking victim. So we want to keep that in mind, and also keep in mind, in addition to individuals not identifying as human trafficking victims, not knowing that there's such a thing as anti-trafficking laws in this country, that there's other vulnerabilities that prevent that individual from seeking support. And those same vulnerabilities also could increase the likelihood that an individual can end up being exploited. So for example, language barriers are huge. For foreign-born victims of human trafficking, language barriers are huge, cultural barriers, use of translators, particularly in smaller communities where the interpreter might know a family member, might know that the trafficker himself. Immigration issues can pose a huge challenge. Fear of authority or police is really significant. Again, particularly with human trafficking survivors, if they're foreign-born, a lot of the information that they have about law enforcement is being filtered through the trafficker, so that can really prevent somebody from seeking support. Another huge concern is ambivalence, because like domestic violence and sexual assault, what we've found over the years of doing this work is that large majority of human trafficking situations, the victim actually knows the perpetrator. So going back to the myths that Sharon spoke about earlier, there's a huge myth that in human trafficking cases that somebody was kidnapped from their home against their will. And again, what we've seen is in the majority of the cases, individuals are being trafficked by their partners, by their family members, by friends, by individuals that they know and they trust. So there's a lot of ambivalence around seeking support, seeing themselves as being exploited. Another issue that comes up quite frequently is the lack of work history and the dependence on that particular trafficker. So I want to go through with you a scenario that's unfortunately a very common scenario, the types of cases that we see in our organization. So Aisha is a 28-year-old woman from India. She holds a master's degree in engineering. Several months ago, Aisha moved to the U.S. with her new husband, Robert. And prior to marrying Aisha and bringing her to the U.S., Robert assured her that she could pursue her career goals in the U.S. However, shortly after arriving in the U.S., Aisha discovered that Robert had a fiancée and had brought her here to serve as a cook and a maid and a nanny to his younger brother and also support his parents. For several months, Robert and his family emotionally and physically abused Aisha, and her day would begin sharply at 6 a.m. and often didn't end until midnight when she was done with all her chores. Aisha had no means to return to her home country. She was also here under her husband's legal status, so she didn't have any legal status of her own, and she was under constant surveillance from Robert or his family. So when we think about the situation with Aisha, so a couple questions come up. And the first one is Aisha a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner abuse? And is she also a victim of labor trafficking? So I'm going to let you all answer that poll.
Okay, does everybody have, there we go.
Okay, so here we have the poll results. 24% of you feel that Aisha is a victim of domestic violence, and 76% of you feel that she's also a victim of labor trafficking. So as we think about domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, and basically what that means is that when one individual uses different power and control tactics to first exert and then maintain power and control over their partner in the context of an intimate relationship, we did see several control tactics that are being used by Robert several tactics that are used by Robert to control Aisha. So first of all, her immigration status, the fact that she's under constant surveillance from Robert and his family, the fact that his family and Robert also physically have abused Aisha. So we do see that the intimate partner abuse dynamic tactics that are being used by Robert against Aisha to exert power and control. So yes, she would be considered a domestic violence victim. And then we also saw some of the tactics that Sharon spoke about in terms of the labor trafficking piece. So I want to go into the next. I want to share another scenario with you. And unfortunately, both Tanya and Aisha, while their names have been changed, these are actually two situations that our organization, two individuals that our organization supported. And unfortunately, their stories are very common. So in Tanya's scenario, Tanya has been dating Philip for several months. A few months ago, he convinced her to move into his apartment. Shortly after she moved in, Philip began calling her names, pushing her around. He demanded that she turn over her paycheck every week so that he could administer the finances, and he slowly began to isolate Tanya from her friends and family, insisting that their influence was damaging to the relationship. Last week, Philip told Tanya that they just could not make ends meet unless she started bringing in more money. When Tanya said that she could do more work at the bakery, Philip replied that that would not be enough. He told Tanya she could make a lot of money as a sex worker. When she refused, he beat her and threatened to kick her out of the apartment. Having nowhere to go and afraid of Philip's escalating abuse, Tanya agreed to have sex for money. Philip made all of the arrangements and kept the majority of the money. So again, in this situation, is Tanya a victim of domestic violence? And is she also potentially a victim of trafficking, of sex trafficking? Okay, so it seems like in this scenario, the domestic violence was more identifiable. So 47% believe that Tanya is a victim of domestic violence, and 53% also believe that she's a victim of sex trafficking. So I want to talk a little bit more about intersections and similarities between or amongst domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And I think that what's really important well, let me backtrack a little bit. In 2003, when the domestic violence and sexual assault service providers in Santa Clara County became involved in the issue of human trafficking, we did so for several reasons. I think the first reason is that we realized that a lot of the cases that were presenting as domestic violence victims, as sexual assault victims, were also human trafficking victims. And not to say that any type of abuse is worse than the other, but it's really important to identify, as we'll talk about later, why, if somebody's potentially a human trafficking victim, why it's so important to identify them as such in terms of the benefits that they're entitled to. But the other reason that we became involved is that we realized that like domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking is focused on or based on power and control, and that a lot of times victims face similar barriers when they want to leave an abusive situation and reintegrate into the community. So for example, lack of legal status. We also recognize that survivors have similar needs for basic services and safety planning, going back to what I said earlier, that the majority of the human trafficking victims that we've worked with over the last decade, the large majority, I venture to say as high as 95% of them, actually knew the traffickers, were depending on their traffickers for housing, for food, for employment. So it's really important to think about that once that individual is removed from the situation, there's going to be safety needs that come up. There's going to also be needs for basic services such as shelter, food, clothing, legal representation, etc. So those are another area where domestic violence and sexual assault service providers have a lot of expertise and have been supporting survivors with those needs for several decades now. The other piece is that survivors may experience significant economic and financial abuse and need to create economic independence. Again, the majority of the human trafficking survivors that we have supported, whether they were being trafficked by their intimate partner, whether they were being trafficked by family members, by individuals that brought them into this country, or by friends or whatnot, they were dependent to a certain extent economically on that trafficker and needed to release a lot of support to regain self-sufficiency. So that piece is really important. Okay, so when we think about intersections of with domestic violence, again, we talk a lot about, when we think about the definition of domestic violence, and that it is about exerting and then maintaining power and control over an individual. However, if the perpetrator is also exploiting the victim, like in both cases that we saw here, and we think about the case of Tanya, the perpetrator was also exploiting Tanya, forcing her to do sex work so that he could benefit financially from that, then that's a key distinction. That exploitation factor is a key distinction, whether or not a situation is domestic violence, or whether it's domestic violence and labor trafficking, domestic violence and sex trafficking. So it's really important to try to tease out as you speak to your clients. Look for those indicators in terms of is this person, in addition to controlling their partner, are they also somehow exploiting them for labor or for sex trafficking purposes? Did you want to answer that?
Oh, I just also wanted to note that many times when we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation, they may also be a victim, and so they get slightly higher status, particularly in the case of commercial sexual exploitation of children. What you find is many times the pimp or the trafficker will use one of the victims, of the survivors, as a recruiter, and so you get both of these indicators. And just to be aware of that somebody who has perpetrator indicators may also be a victim as well.
Okay, so when we think about the intersections, where is that fine line in terms of this case rises to the level of not just domestic violence, but also labor trafficking? And how to identify those intersection cases with labor trafficking? They must include some type of labor component. So whether that's involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or some form of slavery. The labor could be in the home or at the trafficker's business. It could be, as long as the trafficker is benefiting from the proceeds. So we have seen cases, for example, of men selling their daughters. In fact, our first human trafficking case here in Santa Clara County is a young woman, a 14-year-old, that was sold by her father back at home. And fortunately, she was able to escape and seek support. We've also had multiple women that come into our domestic violence agency seeking support for domestic violence issues, and then upon additional screening, I realized that their abusers were also exploiting them for their labor. For example, a woman whose husband owned a string of bakeries and basically had her work day and night, never paid her she never earned any money, and he was exploiting her for several years. So there has to be some type of benefit, financial benefit, to the exploiter. And then, according to the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, there also has to be some form of fraud, coercion, and or force. So we think about back to Aisha's case, there was definitely fraud, because when Robert made the arrangements for Aisha they made their marriage arrangements, she came to the U.S. under the understanding that she was going to be able to pursue her academic goals, that she was going to be able to pursue her career, that she was going to marry Robert, and they were going to have a family of their own. And in fact, when she got here, she realized that he had completely lied to her, and he already had a fiance and brought her here to work as basically a nanny and a maid for his family. In the case of Tanya, we saw the use of force. We saw the use of coercion, and when that didn't work, then there was the use of force. So I just say, look out for the nuances in the state laws, because in California, and Sharon can add to this if she like, there's a need for depriving that individual of their liberty in order for a situation to be considered human trafficking.
And that's included in one of the supplemental handouts. The California definition does differ from the federal definition, and that becomes really important when we're talking about the criminal justice system. But we tend to focus on the federal definition because really that's where a lot of the benefits stem from. They stem from this federal definition. So just to note that the California definition does differ in the sense that there's a requirement to show deprivation of liberty, which is more nuanced, and in some ways it's harder to prove in the criminal justice system. But just because someone may not be able to show that in the criminal justice system doesn't mean they wouldn't be eligible for benefits or support in other ways. And so that's kind of the key distinction.
Okay. So some of the sections in your OCAT system that may address human trafficking indicators include the section on housing. And so there's one question that's included, and it's actually bold here. It's bolded, are there locks that you don't control, or are there curfews? So there are other questions in terms of identifying, and other questions around housing factors that could tease out whether somebody's potentially being trafficked. So for example, how large is the residence? How many people are living there? In cases of in labor trafficking cases, particularly, we've had situations where there are like 20 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. Where does the individual eat and sleep? In Aisha's case, she had to sleep in the basement. what is the individual's relationship to the other occupants? Do they have their own room, their own space? Who do they pay for rent? Do they pay a landlord or do they pay their employer? That one is particularly important. The majority, again, the majority of the labor trafficking victims that we have worked with had to pay rent to their employer. Do all the individuals that work in that household, they all work together? Is the individual free to come and go as they please? That one is really important. In terms of transportation, there is a section in the OCAT system around transportation, but it really focuses more on the difficulties of obtaining transportation. For teasing out potential human trafficking victims, some questions that could be asked is, how does the individual get around? Are they in control of coming and going to work, or is someone else picking them up and dropping them off? Again, with a lot of the labor trafficking victims that we have worked with, and also intersection domestic violence, human trafficking cases, sex trafficking cases, the individual is not allowed to come and go to work. They have somebody that's transporting them. Okay, so in terms of employment or finances, again, one of the questions that's included in your system is, are you free to leave work? Again, that could be that somebody might feel that they're not free to leave, but it really might come from a sense of obligation, not necessarily that they're being deprived of their liberty. So in terms of employment, we could also ask about the working conditions. Where do they work? Are they entitled to breaks? Are they being paid what they were promised? And what is being deducted from wages? Because Sharon could chime in on this as well, but my understanding is that it's against the law to deduct any type of rent payments or debt from wages. And here you're trying to look for any indicators of force, of fraud or coercion. And then inability to leave means that someone is not allowing them to leave. But it could be because they owe a debt, or maybe the family owes a debt, but also it could be more than that. It could be that that person might be being threatened. Perhaps they have a visa that's linked to a particular workplace, and is the individual, is a trafficker holding that against them? That piece is really important. There are certain industries that are a higher risk for labor trafficking, the janitorial industry, construction, hospitality. We've also seen cases of street vendors, of ice cream vendors in the agricultural sector and the beauty industry as well. And then in terms of debts, teasing out whether that individual, do they have their own bank account? Where do they keep their money? Does somebody have to hold their money for them? That's also important. Okay, so the last section I want to talk a little bit about is the section on health. So questions that could be teased out in terms of to determine whether or not somebody might potentially be a human trafficking victim is questions about their overall health conditions. Do they have the ability to receive treatment? Does somebody control their access to treatment? Do they have to depend on someone to take them to the hospital? Can they just make their appointments whenever they feel that they have concerns about their health? Are there long-standing health conditions, and is there an ability to access treatment? And again, does someone else control access? With regards to mental health, is the individual fearful of someone? And if so, why? Try to chase that out a little bit. Are they worried about their safety or the safety of someone they care about, for example, a family member back at home? And then the other substance use, so you could look for indications of whether or not the client is being provided or forced to take drugs or alcohol or being coerced. So before I turn it over to Sharon, I mentioned earlier that it's not that human trafficking is a worse form of abuse than domestic violence or sexual assault. But there are legal remedies, and there's also benefits that are established in the law that a human trafficking victim can access, where a domestic violence or sexual assault victim may not necessarily be able to access. For example, if somebody is a foreign-born victim of human trafficking, they're entitled to 8 months of federal benefits once they've been certified as a human trafficking victim that include cash aid, Medi-Cal, and food assistance. In California, when the California's anti-human trafficking law was passed, there's also set aside in the state law 8 months of state benefits. So if somebody's identified as a human trafficking victim, then they would have access to 8 months of state benefits of cash aid, Medi-Cal, and food assistance, and then as soon as they're certified at the federal level, an additional 8 months. So those are 16 months of benefits that unfortunately a domestic violence or sexual assault victim would not have access to. And there's also provision in the TVPA for a trafficking visa that would not be made available to a domestic violence or sexual assault survivor. So just to keep those in mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon.
So really, we just wanted to kind of provide some tips on where you might be able to record this information. I mean, you have a handful, I think it was 6 questions specific to human trafficking, and yet we saw that there are certain areas where you might actually find other red flags of human trafficking. And so in looking through your system, it seems like you can, with regards to the action plans, is where you can really note down where some of these red flags, where you're seeing some of these red flags. So if you have significant indications of domestic violence, and there's also some indicators of human trafficking, that in the action plan itself is where you can reflect that. And again, in terms of reporting, one of the key things really is we've definitely provided a lot of information regarding red flags, and the reality is that red flags may just be that. They just may be flags, but they may not actually, it may not be a situation of trafficking, but there's never any harm in referring someone to an attorney or a case manager who might be able to flesh that out further. You don't actually have to determine if your client is a victim of human trafficking. Again, advocates and attorneys can fully assess whether or not that person is a victim of trafficking, or maybe they're eligible for other services. So really, we want to encourage referring a client for services. And as Perla noted, nobody identifies as a human trafficking victim. So the way that the referrals really should be focused is on what the primary service or need is. So tailoring the referral to the primary need. So if they're living in a situation where there's a number of people in a home and they feel like they cannot leave because of status, then maybe it's an immigration attorney they need to be referred to, or an agency who can help them with the housing piece. So really focusing on that might help encourage someone to access services rather than getting them to admit that there's any kind of exploitation. In terms of locating resources, we always recommend the national hotline, which I actually didn't write down here, but it's in the supplementals, and it's very easy. It's 888-3737-888. The national hotline is run by Polaris Project. One of the key things to know about Polaris and the national hotline is they have very specific protocols for each county in the U.S. So in Santa Clara County, they have 3 cell phone numbers for law enforcement, an attorney, and Perla, service provider, that if they have a report of trafficking, they can directly call someone who has the appropriate training and can provide trauma-informed services for that individual. So National Hotline is always a good resource if you're not sure of what your next step is. The other thing is there are a lot of coalitions in the area. And again, coalitions are great because they're a nexus to the variety of resources. I also included in the supplementals a specific note about CSEX, so the commercial sexual exploitation of children. There are very specific protocols that are existing in many counties based on legislation. So it'd be a good idea to check with your Department of Family and Children's Services to see if your county has been working on a CSEX specific protocol. It makes a difference in terms of the reporting and just in terms of who has jurisdiction over different things. In our county, DFCS is the responding agency, and then they are linked up regardless of who identifies the CSEC survivor. So it's definitely worth finding out in your area who, whether the protocol exists, and then your coalitions. And the key piece also is that there are a lot of agencies that provide a variety of services, but agencies that have specific knowledge based on human trafficking can provide different resources, and so that's really the key here. The different resources, but also the trauma-informed piece. Being victim-centered and trauma-informed is crucial when we're talking about trafficking survivors who many times access services at a minimum of 2 years. And again, I just reiterated that the referrals should be based on the immediate concern of the individual. So if you feel like that you know, there are red flags that indicate maybe labor trafficking, it might be appropriate to say maybe a referral to an employment or labor attorney might be a good next step. Again, the housing. Of course, if there are safety issues, then law enforcement would be a good next step. But again, I would caution against just calling your local police department unless you know the individual or that they have a human trafficking unit. You might want to call the human trafficking hotline to see who in that area is trauma informed with regards to human trafficking, and get that law enforcement agency to provide response. Just in terms of the structure, I gave an overview in the beginning. And the structure of our coalition is pretty similar to a lot of other coalitions, but it gives you an idea of where those nexus of resources is. There are community outreach groups that actually do direct outreach to potential survivors. They help with awareness raising. And so everybody has a different role to play. It'd be great to have CalWorks more involved in the coalitions as well, because with 8.6% of identifications already in your system, I think it'd be great to be able to link people up. Part of being trauma informed is really efficiency of resources and being able to get individuals connected to resources as quickly as possible.
So I didn't get ahead of myself earlier. I just wanted to make sure to stress why it's really important to talk to clients and tease out if somebody is potentially a human trafficking survivor. This is just, for me, and I think for all survivors, critically important because of the additional benefits that a human trafficking survivor could be potentially eligible for. And so the purpose of identifying whether or not someone is a human trafficking victim is to make sure that they are aware of their rights and that they're connected to services such as the state and federal social service benefits that I mentioned. If there's concerns around immigration, there could be an opportunity to access a U visa or T visa or continued presence. There's opportunities for civil restitution, particularly around for labor trafficking, for wage theft and compensation for damages. And also the protection piece is really important, and that's why we talk a lot about the structure of the coalition and how the 4 P's of trafficking, the protection of victims, prosecution of traffickers, prevention, et cetera, and doing it through a partnership approach is really important, because a lot of these individuals are left vulnerable when they are able to leave in a situation where they're being exploited. Medical assistance is really important. A lot of the survivors that we work with have perhaps chronic conditions that they have not been able to address due to the situation, and a lot of them, unfortunately, because of the trauma, develop depression, PTSD. So we want to make sure that they're receiving also the mental health support that they need, and other resources that are available to support human trafficking survivors as they go through their healing process.
And I don't know if we've already mentioned this, but some of these other resources might be in the way of family law. Sometimes custody is a tool that a trafficker will use, custody over the victim's child. Or, that was basically the one I wanted to point out, the family law. Or afterwards, actually, criminal defense might be applicable. Sometimes there are issues of identity theft where the trafficker has used their identity. So just keep those in mind as well. Just in terms of next steps, we thought, there are questions on human trafficking in your system, but you can adjust your intake process for your new clients in order to identify potential red flags and be able to ask further questions to flesh out whether or not someone might be a trafficking victim. You may want to review your current caseload based on the strengths and barriers and see where we tend to find that individuals feel like something made them uncomfortable with their client. They're like, something's not quite right, and they don't quite know how to flesh it out. Hopefully we've provided some more tools in that way. Advocate for more trainings and supplemental materials. We'd love to see if the OCAT system would have the national hotline under the resources, integrate some of these human trafficking questions into the intakes, and of course connecting in your area with others working on this issue. Here are some resources. I included the human trafficking hotline number here, as well as their resource center. Office for Victims of Crime have a number of resources, and Polaris Project. We also included the link to our regional work group, No Traffic Ahead. The coalition helped spearhead this work group, and it just provides links to a number of different agencies working on this issue. And so with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Sure thing. Sorry, this is Christina. Sure thing. So we do have a few questions. You guys actually touched on them to some extent, but maybe you can clarify a little bit more. So the first one is, what are the reporting responsibilities regarding suspected or reported human trafficking for those of us who are mandated reporters?
So in terms of I think that the requirement is to report if there's a child, if there's somebody underage that is a commercially sexually exploited child or at risk of commercial sexual exploitation. That's the only mandated report that's required. Medical providers are also, if there's an issue of domestic violence, medical providers are required to provide that. But other than that, the commercial sexual exploitation of a minor is now something that's reportable due to the change in the Welfare and Institutions Code.
Okay, thank you. Before I read the second question, as a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to type that in the pod. The second question is, which counties have the highest human trafficking rates in California?
And that's actually a really good question. And I think that in terms, there's a trafficking in persons report, statewide, that was put out in 2012 was the last time. And if I recall correctly, and Sharon will correct me if I'm wrong, Santa Clara, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Sacramento are the 4 counties that come up with the highest reports of human trafficking.
And I can also just add on that a few things. One is, when we're talking about those areas, those are all major metropolitan areas. So you have a mixture of a lot of commerce, a lot of people, and a lot of highways. So there's a lot of interstate movement. So that combination also leads to that. Another quick notation about the numbers that we see about trafficking. We always try to remind people to be mindful of the data that comes out around trafficking, because most times it reflects arrest data. And what we know is that law enforcement is able to identify sex trafficking of minors far more easily than the other types of trafficking. So what we've seen on a local scale is when you speak to immigration attorneys and service providers, they tend to have more of a 50-50 split of labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and of course a lot of that intersection. But when you look at arrest numbers, it tends to reflect a much higher percentage of sex trafficking, particularly of minors. And so just keeping in mind that it may be, part of how data is reported. For law enforcement, it's far easier for them to investigate an act that is already criminal, so prostitution. And for them, again, when we're talking about CSEC, it's a lot easier in the criminal justice system because they don't have to show that force, fraud, or coercion or deprivation of liberty. So not to say that the numbers are not valid, just keep in mind that a lot of trafficking is very much hidden and invisible, and so keeping that in mind.
Thank you. We did get one question which I can quickly answer, and that is whether or not this presentation will be on the Learning Center, and yes, it will be. The presentation as well as the handouts. Another question for our speakers: are certain ethnic communities with propensity for trafficking being specifically targeted, or does political correctness impact the government's role in investigating these matters?
So if you say if certain ethnic communities are being targeted, I think that goes back to the statements that I made earlier, that the majority of the traffickers know their victims, and particularly when we're talking about foreign-born. So the cases that I've seen of foreign-born human trafficking victims, when they're Mexican, they're actually being trafficked by Mexicans. When they're from Nicaragua, they're being trafficked by Nicaraguans. So there isn't one particular ethnicity that's trafficking another more per se, and that goes back to the dynamic of the majority of victims knowing their traffickers. So we have seen at this point in the 10 years that we've been doing this work, we have seen foreign-born human trafficking survivors from every continent at this point. And again, including, and the majority of the cases, now that the focus is so much on domestic sex trafficking of minors, as Sharon mentioned earlier, we used to see a pretty even split, 50% sex trafficking, 50% labor trafficking of foreign-born individuals. And now our numbers have changed, where 70% of the cases that we're seeing of human trafficking are domestic sex trafficking victims. And so unfortunately, it does happen one piece of data that's really heartbreaking for me, in Santa Clara County, we looked at the numbers, and about roughly 50% of the commercially sexually exploited children that our agency served in this course of a year are of African American descent, and yet African Americans only represent 3% of the population here in Santa Clara County. So there's a huge overrepresentation of African American youth that are being commercially sexually exploited. And so that piece is something that we're very concerned about, that we definitely need to ensure that there's services and support, protection, and prosecution towards the individuals that are exploiting these youth.
And I'll also say that we definitely approach, so it's less an issue of political correctness and more an issue of being culturally competent, that we realize that there are certain, especially when you start splicing out certain industries, you'll find that certain groups are exploited in certain industries more. And so in terms of being culturally competent, we do try to target community outreach in a way that resonates with that community. So, you know, different kinds of outreach cards in various languages, trainings to different groups to ensure that really, absolutely, that we're preventing and providing information to a variety of communities.
Okay. So I got more additional questions about how can you get the handouts. If you're only listening to this, again, you will get the handouts on the Learning Center. Let's see. We have come across issues of sex trafficking taking place at cultural festivals in our area. Where are the victims being taken against their will? Are they moved to other locations in the U.S.?
So what we've seen here, particularly with the domestic sex trafficking, there's definitely paths that I think for sex traffickers particularly, it's really important for them to keep their victims isolated. So there is a ring that can go from Vegas to Sacramento to Santa Clara to Alameda to San Francisco, and the purpose of that is to keep the victims isolated and to keep them to prevent the victim from being able to establish friendships, to establish support, and that somebody is able to assist them in getting out of that situation. Here in Santa Clara County, particularly with minor victims of commercial sexual exploitation, we see a lot of young women that are being brought in from Sacramento, particularly, in Alameda County.
Okay, all right. Let's see. I think we have time for maybe just one more question. Would relaxed immigration or open border status increase the opportunity for sex or human trafficking?
Can you repeat the question, I'm sorry?
Oh, sure. Would relaxed immigration or an open border status increase the opportunity for sex or human trafficking?
No, I think that goes back to dispelling the myth that human trafficking only occurs when somebody's brought across the border. And when we think particularly about sex trafficking, that's why I make sure to make the point that 70% of human trafficking cases that we're seeing now are domestic sex trafficking cases. So these are young women, young men, sometimes older women, older men that are being trapped, that were born here in the U.S., that are U.S. citizens, that are being sexually trafficked here. So I don't think that necessarily any change in the status, the immigration status would there's traffickers are always going to find a way to find individuals that they can exploit, unfortunately, and that they can make a profit out of.
Okay. I think that's it for questions and timing, actually. So if folks have additional questions, feel free to send that in, and we will pass it on to our speakers, and the responses will be posted on the Learning Center. But in the interest of time, let me turn it. Let me, on behalf of OCAP, thank our speakers. As usual, if you have any questions or have any needs, please email the help desk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.